Hi, and welcome to the last panel on the last day of this incredible 5-day festival. We've all been hardy festival goers, and we're here at the last moment. I'm David Herzberg, a historian at the University of Buffalo and a SUNY system. Thrilled to be here to cap off what's been a great and incredibly informative and fascinating, stimulating 5 days. Just a few notes from our esteemed head honcho, Luke Rickard, wants us to remind you that everyone who submitted a paper or who intends to submit a paper, that we are going to be in touch in the coming weeks. And by we, I mean the editors of the 3 journals who are participating in the event and are looking forward to doing publications based on it, which is, of course, the social history. I'm not going to say them all because I want to have people have the time to present their papers, and I think people already know them. All the videos are going to be posted on the AIHP website so we can watch them in the future. If you had to miss a panel or if you want to go back to a panel, they'll be there. And if you have the ability and interest in doing so, share that information with others so that other people who weren't able to make it to the event can go and check out some of the presentations. Also, just a plug, this event has been supported by and participated by the Alcohol and Drug History Society, the Canadian Society for the History of Medicine, and of course, the American Institute for the History of Pharmacy. If you are not already a member of one of those organizations, consider joining them because we do awesome things like this. All right, because of time limits, I'm going to try to keep this introduction speedy. I'm going to also, just a heads up to the panelists, of course, I'll be keeping an eye on the time and to make sure that there's time for Q&A at the end. So I'm going to introduce all of the panelists here at the beginning, and then we'll go through each presentation. So the first panel has Erica Dick and Matt Savelli. Erica Dick is professor and Canada Research Chair in the History of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan, where she researches and teaches the history of psychiatry and mental health. She's the author of far too many books and articles to list by name here that focus on eugenics and, more to the point of today's presentation, hallucinogens and other psychoactive medicines. Matt Savelli is assistant professor and undergraduate chair of the Department of Health, Aging and Society at McMaster University, where he focuses on evolving beliefs about mental health and illness, particularly in communist Europe. He's published multiple articles and book chapters and is a co-auditor of several books. And today they're going to be presenting work based on a SSHRC Insight grant and recent article in the history of pharmacy and history, on psychoactivity for sale, with a talk on crafting the modern via psychoactivity in advertisements. Second presenter is Jacques Guyot, received a master's degree in the history and philosophy of science and medicine at the University of Cambridge and is currently a medical student at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York City. He'll be presenting on work drawn from his master's dissertation on patent medicine advertising in British Guiana in 1880-1920. And finally, Wouter Klein received his PhD from Utrecht University in the history of science with a special interest in the history of pharmacy and medicines in the early modern period. His dissertation and article publications focus on the history and commodification of plant medicines, and his presentation today builds on that commodification angle with a talk on newspaper advertising and the start of a global market for drugs in the 18th century. These are great topics, work so well together. I'm really looking forward to it. Please remember questions. You can post them in the chat box. Then when the presentations are over, I'll read those questions to the panelists. And let's get going. Erica and Matt.
Thanks so much, David. Matt is going to share our content, and we're going to attempt to seamlessly, smoothly co-present this in a timely manner. We're really delighted to be part of this conference and to be presenting this very, very preliminary work that Matt Savelli and I have been working on for the past couple of years with the support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council in Canada. And what we've set off to do is craft a kind of a global project, which is really interesting to do in the time when we can't actually travel. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then Matt's going to actually talk about the meat of this presentation. What we've been doing is over the past 2 years, we've been working with research assistants and collecting information for a database. This is just a quick screenshot of the database. It is a library-based system, and we've collected a little over 5,000 articles now, advertisements from medical periodicals and from popular periodicals that are published in India, Colombia, Senegal, former Yugoslavia, and in Canada. And what we're doing is trying to track the way that psychoactivity has been advertised over time and place in what we hope will be a global comparative study. And what we're finding is that really the study of psychoactivity for sale is a study of capitalism. And Matt's going to elaborate on that in a moment, but perhaps you can go to the next slide, Matt. I want to emphasize how much this project relies on the really talented and skilled work of many research assistants. This is a quick screenshot that they didn't obviously know I was taking, but they have given me permission to use in this moment. And I just want to make sure that we acknowledge the many, many people behind the scenes who've been working on this. Without them, we could not do this work. These are talented undergraduates and graduate students who are multilingual and who have an incredible set of resources who've been really critical to making this project work. And because we've been doing a lot of this work this summer when we couldn't travel, we've really relied on trying to learn different media platforms like this, but we've also been using things like Slack so that the students can actually continue to be connected even though they aren't all living, certainly not in the same neighborhood, not even in the same city, certainly not in the same time zone. And we're using different platforms to try to maintain that sense of community and to work through some of the questions together. We've blurred this out so that you can't see them complaining about my my whip cracking work, but maybe go to the next slide, Matt. So I'm going to pass this over to Matt in a moment, who's going to talk about some of our preliminary conclusions on this. But I just want to emphasize that what we're finding in this really interesting study of advertisements over time, over really about 100 years and across 5 different political jurisdictions, is that psychoactivity and modernity are intimately linked together. And I will pass that on to Matt then. I think I've done my 3 minutes. Matt, you're muted.
Yes, Matt.
Hello, can you hear me now, people?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful, thank you. Sorry, I've been trying to unmute, but God knows what the hell is going on. So this is obviously just a very preliminary discussion about the things that we found. Because we're dealing with huge numbers of things over really long periods of time. Our project actually runs from 1888 to 2001. So trying to come to grips with that has been quite a difficult process. But over the summer, because as Erica mentioned, we had all of these wonderful research assistants entering into the database. For the first time, we could begin to sort of see the big picture. And this is really just an attempt to talk about that a little bit. So what we're really going to focus on today is just the ways in which advertisers of psychoactive substances, alcohol, nicotine products, caffeine products, psychopharmaceuticals, the way that advertisers sort of linked those products to modernity, both implicitly and explicitly. So I'm just going to talk about 3 themes really briefly. The first is that psychoactivity sort of gets framed as not just a pathway to nationhood, but as a way of sort of achieving national belonging. I think this is something a lot of people are, we're already familiar with in our own lives, but what I want to sort of demonstrate, or what we're going to show in the slides, is just this is a very old thing. Secondly, we were going to highlight the way that advertisers framed their products as markers of modernity. And in a lot of ways, I think this is especially significant in the global South, where sort of having access to these goods was positioned as a way of joining the quote-unquote modern world. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about how psychoactivity and psychoactive products got framed by advertisers as a way of responding to or dealing with the problems inherent in the modern world. So we could have drawn on all sorts of examples, Canada during World War I, India after partition, Yugoslavia in the 1990s. There's really no limit to how often advertisers linked the nationhood and modernity with psychoactivity. But I want to talk just about 2. So the first is Colombia during the 1950s. So in the briefest sense, this was a period known as La Violencia. it sort of was marked by a civil war that positioned a conservative, or what some people have actually called a fascist government, against the capital L Liberal Party. And that conservative government framed the Liberal Party as enemies of the national project. And what we see is, like, during this 10-year period, roughly from 1948 to 1959, the place of the nation and the ways in which psychoactive products were linked to the nation was something that was really underscored. So, for example, the Colombian Tobacco Company ran a series of ads that, over maybe 5 or 6 years, that used the same motif. The ads functioned as a letter to the people of Colombia, to the government of Colombia, and situated tobacco products as something to be celebrated by the country, but also sort of advanced this idea that tobacco companies owed the people something, owed Colombians something. So in this one, they talk about how they'd made, quote, fervent vows of the country, noting that they were proud of our nationality. We will remain faithful to our principles and ideals. To progress, it is necessary to serve. Other advertising campaigns similarly focused on this notion that to be modern meant to have a strong sense of national identity. And this is something many scholars have talked about, sort of how, if we want to think about the modern project, or the sort of the markers of modernity, it's practically impossible to avoid talking about nationhood and nationalism. This comes out in ads, for example, for a rum company, Ron Viejo. So they ran a series of ads like the ones on the left. How lucky is Colombia for, and then ... all sorts of natural resources for its coffee beans, for its tobacco, and indeed for its rum, in this case for Ron Viejo. Another ad campaign, same company, sort of changed the motifs a little bit later. You can see here these pictures of rural workers with messages about how for centuries, the Colombian countryside and rainforest had gone untouched and underdeveloped. But finally now Colombians were beginning to do this. Colombians who, by the way, drink Ron Viejo. In Senegal, which took its independence from France in 1960, similarly, ideas of the nation were foregrounded. So I'm just going to talk about two particular products today, Stork and Gazelle beer, which were both made by the same Dakar-based brewery. Prior to independence, ads for these sorts of products focused on their quality, their low price, their taste, and so on. But with the Declaration of Independence, they changed tack really quickly. So this is an ad from 1960 for Stork beer, and it was part of a series of ads where essentially they kind of discussed the imagined national drink of all sorts of countries. In Italy they drink Chianti, in Iceland they drink grog, in Russia they drink vodka, and so on and so on and so on. But with the important message that here we drink Stork beer, the beer adapted to the climate, in this case the climate of West Africa. In this ad campaign for Gazelle, which ran for years, they sort of positioned Gazelle beer as the successor to Dolo, which they're calling the ancient beer, or the traditional African drink, the ancestor of Dolo. You can see all sorts of images around these sort of traditional vessels for drinking and producing Dolo, etc. And all of these things were sort of meant, I think, to suggest to consumers that one way to achieve nationhood was to participate in psychoactivity. In other words, to consume these products, it was a way of achieving belonging. As a sort of second theme, as I mentioned before, a lot of ad campaigns ran with the idea that to be modern meant to have access to particular forms of psychoactive substances. Doubtlessly, Coca-Cola was the example par excellence in this case. So this is an ad from 1968 from a Serbian newspaper, And the headline here says, from today on our markets, the world-renowned Coca-Cola. So prior to this point, in communist Yugoslavia, a lot of Western consumer goods had been banned, sort of being too decadent and too bourgeois. But the Coca-Cola company set up a bottling factory in Serbia. You can see pictures of that in the background. And Coca-Cola's arrival was meant to sort of mark Yugoslavia joining the modern world. So it's different. The image quality is not great here, but in the images at the bottom, there are all sorts of pictures of the bottling plant itself and the various machine processes involved. Again, meant to sort of underscore how modern Yugoslavia was becoming through, one, these new technological practices, but secondly, through the very existence of Coca-Cola itself. And Coke ran that same message many, many, many times. So in Senegal in the 1960s, people were told, finally, Coke is here. In India in the 1990s, Coke returned to the country. It had previously been kicked out in the mid 1970s after Indira Gandhi's government. This is a lot of detail. Essentially, passed a law that made it much more taxing for foreign multinational companies. So Coke left. During the market liberalization in the 1990s, Coke returned, and consumers were told, finally, what you've been waiting for is here. And they actually had a gigantic parade in Mumbai to celebrate the return of Coke. Coke adversary, Pepsi, also arrived in India during the 90s, during that market liberalization. And again, it was framed as a way for the new India to join the modern world. Right, so I won't read all of the text because it's quite cringeworthy. But in this Pepsi ad, readers were told it's the land where the real McCoy is called a Pepsi can, America. It's America, that sort of paragon of consumer consumption, was framed as, really the mark of modernity. And by having access to American goods, Indians were told you too can become modern, and you can tell it's modern. It's got a jet plane, and it's powered by Pepsi flying around and so on. The jet makes its appearance in a number of ads. So this is just one other example from Senegal in the 1960s. This is for Caravi Valpierre, which is a French table wine. So here it's discussed as the perfect product of progress. And just taking some snippets of the text. Our readers were told in 1960, no man would accept anyone who doesn't carry the mark of progress. And having Karavi on your table was, quote, proof of your participation in contemporary progress. And so again, as consumers, people were bombarded with these messages that, you only become modern when you have access to and begin to consume these sorts of products. The last theme, and the one that was, I think, for me, both the most expected, but nonetheless the most interesting, was that psychoactive products were typically positioned as ways to resolve the problems of modern life. The problems of exhaustion, sort of urban chaos, overwork, busyness, loudness, etc. And we saw this theme run across all 5 countries that we looked at for virtually the entirety of our time period. So this ad from the late 19th century in the Times of India talked about coca wine as being indispensable to overworked and worn out men and women, capable of relieving mental and physical fatigue. These types of imagery appeared whether we were talking about beer. So this is a Colombian ad for Costeña, where readers are told, don't overheat yourself, drink Costeña. In other words, escape this mad traffic and some of the other problems of modern life. For the psychopharmaceutical Trisentol, which was advertised in Canadian medical journals in the 1950s, you see all sorts of wonderful little sketches of angry people slamming and picking up phones, the clock ticking, traffic lights. I don't even know, whatever that thing's called where people drill into the concrete. I don't know the word in English, but someone, you can please tell me in the chat after. Right? Viewers were sort of confronted with this paradox. To join the modern world meant to have access to all of these psychoactive products. But at the same time, implicitly you were told this is something good, but at the same time, modernity was a threat. And these products become ways of dealing with that threat of modernity, or dealing with the harms of modernity. So these are all aspirin ads taken from Canadian newspapers, or actually from Maclean's magazine in the mid-1930s. And the theme that runs through them, again, is that the way to resolve the problems of modern life is through aspirin. So, when your head fairly throbs from the stores and crowds, reach for that little box, says the one on the left. The one in the center says, it's not necessary to give in to that headache. It's a bit old-fashioned. The modern woman who feels a headache coming on at any time takes some tablets of aspirin and heads it off. And finally, my favorite, fatigue. I just postpone it. Similarly, these types of drugs, so aspirins, African equivalent Aspro, use the same sorts of themes, same sorts of imagery, same sorts of lexical choices. So in these two ads for Aspro here, again from the 1960s, you see people who are overworked. This poor guy Gregoire on the right. There's a nice little story at the bottom where he's working in one of these machines, and it's too loud and it's too painful, so he starts to get sore. He starts to get a headache. He's worried about not being able to work, but his foreman comes along, gives him some aspirin, and he's able to get back to work, no problem. And this story finishes quite nicely, where we're told the foreman's not angry anymore.
Just a quick note that you are nearly out of time. Sorry.
Yes. Oh, no, I appreciate it. So actually, yeah, I'm going to turn things back over to Erica to conclude, but Dave, thank you for chiming in.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, David. Matt has done an incredible job of working us through these materials, so I'm only going to conclude very briefly. And just a reminder that we've seen these ads for aspirin or aspirin-related products, so they come up with different names, making them sometimes challenging to chart over different linguistic categories. But we see this commonly associated with both embracing modernity, but also then managing modernity. And you see it in very interesting gendered ways, certainly in terms of work being central to that theme of being both modern, but also the anxieties associated with extra work or too much work or stress of work. And so what we're trying to do here is show our very preliminary findings, but what I hope are very exciting findings that really show that the history is in fact inseparable from a study of global capitalism, and that by looking at these different places and across different categories, we might be able to highlight that more. And I hope that this will provide us with lots of fertile material for lots of people to do research projects on, including all of those exciting RAs. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really fascinating material, and we're going to move right along so we can have time to discuss it later to our second presenter, Jacques. Jacques?
Yes, hi. Okay, hold on, let me share my screen. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. The sharing is connecting, but I can start while it waits. I wish to begin my talk today by thanking everyone who made this festival possible, even in such non-ideal circumstances as these. Special thank yous to Kristen Husett for her patience and organizational prowess, to David Herzberg for facilitating this panel, and to my fellow panelists here today. This paper is concerned with the construction and negotiation of medical and civil authority as discernible through patent medicine advertising. And has it shared now?
Yes.
Great, okay. It will provide an analysis of such advertisements in British Guiana that shifts existing historiographies of advertising, patent medicines, and colonial psychiatric medicine by drawing attention to the interaction between elite and popular medical discourses. While studies of advertising have shown how political, cultural, and commercial interests shape the structure, content, and audiences of newspapers in general, medical advertisements have not received sufficient attention. The colony of British Guiana on the northern coast of South America was valued for its sugar plantations, which were staffed by slaves kidnapped from West Africa, largely Scottish overseers and English owners. After emancipation in 1834, the British colonial government introduced Portuguese and East Indian indentured servants to the colony, and by the turn of the century, immigrants significantly outnumbered natives. 20% of the nearly 300,000 inhabitants lived in the capital, Georgetown, where many Afro-Guyanese had migrated after emancipation. Thus, British Guiana, at the turn of the century, was a country in flux. Previously disenfranchised ethnic groups were gaining economic and civic power, social strata were evolving, and rapid changes in the structure and composition of the medical system led to fierce professional rivalries among different practitioners. Patent medicines played a critical role in shaping these local rivalries. Tracing the influence of patent medicine advertisements across time in this context provides insight into evolutions of key concerns and values of the Guianese, including worries about motherhood and infant mortality, as well as anxieties regarding the strength and reach of the British Empire and whether individuals had the energy levels to preserve and expand it. By analyzing the role that patent medicines played in elite medical discourse and the role that such discourse played in advertisements, I show how patent medicine advertisements were sites in which discursive ideologies, value systems, and models of authority were propagated and manipulated. This paper reframes advertisements, the so-called lower rungs of cultural production, as sites of transmission and negotiation of contemporary elite discourse surrounding colonial breakdown, neurasthenia, and the shaping of the colonial body, arguing that these advertisements were deeply implicated in the establishment of medical authority. A patent medicine, also known as a nostrum, was a commercial product advertised as an over-the-counter medication and available without a prescription. Often billed as a panacea, the active ingredient was typically some combination of alcohol, cocaine, and opiates like laudanum. From prescription medicines on one side and from bush cheese on the other were nebulous, and they were contested in both the medical literature and in commercial advertisements. As in the metropole, patent medicines were widely panned by medical authorities, but enjoyed a large market nevertheless. Patent medicines required no license to be sold, and accordingly, they could be distributed not only by dispensers, but also by shopkeepers and grocers, and by any private citizen looking to make a profit, provided that, quote, the whole contents of a packet or a bottle of the preparation is not more than a poisonous dose, unquote. The elites claimed that the colony's working classes were the most prone to resort to patent medicines. The pricing of advertised medicines indicate that at least some were marketed to the upper classes, rather than to more modest laborers. Wealthier individuals could also send for medicines by mail order directly from the British or American manufacturer. In a society characterized by professional disputes and imperial anxieties, the flexible role that patent medicines occupied in colonial discourse benefited both medical elites and manufacturers. As the medical profession in Guyana diversified, it became more difficult to draw a neat dividing line separating European, white, and legitimate medicine on one side and unorthodox and non-Western systems on the other. As the historian of British Guiana, Juanita de Barros, notes, non-European forms of medical practice like Obeya, quote, had long been represented as a particularly dangerous and uncivilized type of quackery, unquote, and their presence in the health landscapes of British Guiana made professional rivalries notably fraught. Specifically, the expanding role of dispensers, pharmacists of a type whose services were necessary in areas unreached by physicians, triggered professional rivalries and debates regarding the reach of the medical profession, its composition, and the role of medical auxiliaries. While dispensers were recognized and lauded for their services, they were simultaneously suspected, investigated, and dismissed as frauds. In 1905, the governor of Guyana installed a commission of inquiry composed of physicians, municipal politicians, and bureaucrats to investigate the causes of British Guiana's high infant mortality rates. The commission's report shows that it was difficult, or at least inconvenient, to draw sharp lines around the edges of what constituted a patent medicine, and the commission heard testimonies from a variety of witnesses that sought to differentiate patent and proprietary medicines. The commission piled dispensers, druggists, and quacks into an undifferentiated lump whose tools were patent medicines, well-advertised nostrums, and bush teas made from local herbs. Even though patent medicines were themselves of European and North American origin, by grouping these medical auxiliaries like dispensers with quacks and comparing patent medicines to bush teas, the Commission framed these varied practices as one single associated threat to the dominant European mode of administering health. Patent medicines became a useful tool with which to discredit certain non-European, indigenous, or lay forms of knowledge. As Rima Apple has shown, the trend for scientific and medical quote-unquote experts to replace old women as sources of authority and expertise when it came to child rearing had international reach around this time. The existence of patent medicines was at least rhetorically a good enough reason to take control over infants' health away from mothers and confer that authority onto the physician. For instance, one expert testimony who spoke in front of the commission, a Georgetown town overseer and sanitary inspector, and a former overseer on a sugar estate, heavily criticized Black mothers for skimping on buying patent foods and medicines for their infant children. To them, he contrasted Indian mothers, who he claimed spent nearly a third of their husband's income on patent medicines such as Mylan's food. He said of these women that they were, quote, depriving themselves of the actual necessities of life to buy different sorts of patent foods specially prepared for the rearing of infants that have been recommended them to feed their babies on, unquote. Though it was convenient in this instance to categorize patent medicines as a moral good, most other testimonies that the commission heard were outright dismissive of such medicines and of the people they believed foolish enough to buy them. The government medical officer who held a license from the Royal College of Physicians and was a member of the Royal College of Surgeons in London deplored the use of, quote, artificial milk and other patent abominations, unquote, and stated that mothers giving their children patent medicines, quote, certainly, unquote, had a bearing on infant mortality rates. The colony's Surgeon General described artificial milks and proprietary medicines as, quote unquote, death dealing. The use of patent medicines was thus simultaneously a morally necessary financial sacrifice and a child endangering decision. In other words, mothers couldn't win. It reflected similarly poorly on dispensers to prescribe and distribute patent medicines. Based on these and similar testimonies, the commission sided with physicians, determining that dispensers had value as assistants but nothing more, and that quote-unquote untrained midwives and mothers were, by and large, dangerous to the health of their children. Among other recommendations for increased sanitation measures, cheaper milk, and cheaper quinine, they hope to regulate the distribution of patent medicines with licenses, enforce sales restrictions by threat of prosecution, and thus wrest control over healthcare and its profits away from unorthodox providers. Though associations with patent medicines were reasons to take medical authority away from dispensers and from mothers, patent medicines themselves were paradoxically more secure. By 1900, 3 pages out of the 8 of key Georgetown papers like the Daily Chronicle and the Argosy were dedicated solely to advertisements, and 2 of these 3 weekly pages contained mostly patent medicine advertisements. And this is an example of one of those pages, just filled with advertisements. While the idea of patent medicines were used in elite and public discourse to shape policy, they also played a direct, active role in shaping discourse and professional disputes. Each advertisement made choices about whose expertise to invoke. They might lay claim to nature, broadly construed, to the maternal expertise of, say, a mother seagull, or to indigenous knowledge. They might tie themselves to physicians' expertise, or they might dismiss local physicians as quacks and instead claim the cutting-edge therapeutic advances of the European continent. These identifications both express where authority was to be found and helped reinforce these cultural, economic, and professional ties. Similarly, popular medical theories of the day found their way into patent medicine advertisements, which in turn helped popularize such theories. Warwick Anderson's work on tropical neurasthenia in the Philippines conveys stories of the devastating neurasthenic and psychopathic effects of living in the tropics, which, according to officials, often resulted in chronic forgetfulness or quote-unquote brain fag. These were also largely the same symptoms most often described in the health advertisements that peppered British Guianese newspapers, viz. Hysteria, wasting complaints, debility, weakness and low nervous tone, neuralgia, lassitude, mental exhaustion, premature decay, brain fag, faintness, depression, rheumatic pain, loss of flesh, and wasting diseases. Deficiencies of masculinity took up a lot of advertisement space, and injunctions to weak men or to weak, tired, or nervous men were commonplace in the Argosy and the Daily Chronicle. Such imperially minded advertising did not only target men, and many of these advertisements show how the apparatus of state-sponsored medicine could be turned against wealthy white women, as well as those working-class women of color who had been targeted in the Mortality Commission of 1905. Motherhood was intimately linked to the promise of a lasting race and empire, and the threat of racial degeneration worried British whites on both sides of the Atlantic. It was theorized that whites born in the tropics would be physically weak and morally corrupt. Illness in women was framed as a moral issue. If they were tired, they would do a poor job raising their children, supporting their husband, and propping up the empire. They would make their homes, quote unquote, unhappy. It was thus their responsibility, advertisements claimed, to purchase the patent medicines that would provide them with the necessary energy to fulfill their duties to children, to their husbands, and to the empire. One key marketing technique employed by patent medicines was that of the testimonial, which, besides lending some credibility to therapeutic claims, both illuminates where people looked for authority and common ground and helped cement such relations. In addition to lay and physician testimonials, it was common to see testimonials from inhabitants of places outside Guyana. Doan's backache kidney pills regularly shared the experiences of men and women from Trinidad, a British colony that was geographically proximate, but also culturally and demographically akin to Guyana. Trinidad's was not the only market that overlapped with Guyana's, however. One advertisement features the testimonial of a British soldier in India about the salutary effects of Eno's fruit salt. Another, for Pam Allah, touts its alleged success in India as evidence of its potency in Guyana. This strategy contrasted heavily with advertising practices in the metropole. But while advertising in Britain helped construct a national identity and a visual language for its inhabitants, and while Irish advertising at this time began to emphasize Irishness, concomitant with the growth of a cultural and political nationalist revival, advertisements in Guyana did not display any such national awareness or identity. Rather, they emphasized the links across tropical countries and colonies and strengthened ties across the British Empire's possessions. Advertisements for brands like Therapian and Phosphorine contrasted a dazzling, scientifically enlightened metropole with a backwards periphery. Repurposed advertisements from larger colonial markets presented an image of undifferentiated tropical colonies whose lack of national identity served a broader ideology of empire. This paper has shown how patent medicines were tools and actors of the period's societal changes, and how the specter of patent medicines proved a useful cudgel in the professional rivalries pitting physicians against dispensers, obeya, and mothers of all races. It has investigated how wider medical discourse found itself reflected in advertisements, and it has discussed how patent medicine advertisements had some power to mediate lay conceptions of medical authority and disease, and to train readers to approach health and identity in specific ways. Whereas in the metropole, advertisements helped participate in and build a national identity, patent medicines in British Guiana helped create a sense of transcolonial sameness and undifferentiation. Ultimately, this paper seeks to revalorize patent medicine advertisements as sites of cultural production in which value systems were compared, debated, and sometimes discarded, where ideologies were constructed and shared, and where language, identity, and conceptions of health could be molded and evolve. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Let's go on to our last paper so that we'll have time for conversation. Our final presenter is Wouter Klein. Wouter, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Let me share
All
the
right,
screen.
let's go.
There it is. Okay, thank you all for joining for the final talk of the final session of the final day of this great event. I will be talking about newspaper advertising and the start of the global market for drugs already in the 18th century. This is based on my dissertation, but it continues to be a topic of great interest as this data provide well, almost an endless fountain of new innovative research ideas. This research was part initially of the time capsule project at Utrecht University. We have a website where a lot of our data is visualized as well, although the material I will be talking about today is not yet part of that website, but hopefully in the future it will. I will talk today about two opposite ends of the medical marketplace. For argument's sake, I named these the patient's perspective and the merchant perspective. Those are two collections of advertisements I collected. One is about secret or proprietary, if you will, remedies. That's for secret remedies in 18th century Dutch newspapers, and the other collection is about advertisements for auctions of crude drug components. I will discuss both of these and then zoom out to the global perspective, how we can use those, well, Dutch sources for, well, a bigger understanding of global history of pharmacy. Let me start with an introduction. So the collection we're talking about are 18th century Dutch newspapers. These have been digitized by the Dutch National Library on, well, quite a massive scale. There are millions of newspaper pages on their digital platform, Delver, and the 18th century is well represented. What you see here is just a number of issues, digitized newspaper pages for each year of the 18th century. And as you can see, for well, the large 18th century, we have more than 500 issues per year. So that's a massive collection. All these pages have been OCR'd, so they are full text searchable. And this is what they look like typically. So most Dutch cities had a newspaper in the 18th century. Initially, a newspaper consisted of just a front and a back. So just well, one sheet actually, and then gradually throughout the 18th century, most cities expanded to 4, 6, or even 8 pages of newspapers. Material is visually not attractive, so they all look like this. There are, well, virtually no images that are worth mentioning. So schematically, this is what a newspaper in the 18th century looks like. And this already brings me to a big methodological issue, because these sections are the structure to query these newspapers. And a section of ads like the one you see here can contain between 1 and 25 advertisements. But you cannot differentiate between lines, you cannot differentiate between individual advertisements. So there is full text there, but there's a lot of semi-automated work you have to do yourself to study these properly, and that is what I did. So just to give you an idea of what this can yield. So there are two collections of advertisements that I was searching for: secret remedies against fever, a big category of, well, umbrella term for different kinds of diseases in the 18th century. And another collection of public auctions of crude drugs in Amsterdam. The periods differ a bit and the numbers differ a bit, but, well, generally you can find thousands of advertisements for hundreds of remedies and hundreds of public auctions. So that first collection, turn to now. Call them secret or proprietary remedies. I prefer the term secret over proprietary remedies because, contrary to what we know about England, for instance, is that in the 18th century Dutch Republic, there are hardly any regulations, or maybe none at all. I don't really know actually, for protecting these remedies legally. So the one common theme for all these remedies is that they are secret. We do not really know much about the contents of the remedies. We do not really know who their producers are. So there's a lot of secrecy behind many of these medicines. This matter is complicated by the fact that we have very few sources about many remedies that you find in advertisements other than the advertisements themselves. So there are often local producers who advertise once or twice or only a few times just to try and reach a larger audience than by word of mouth alone. You see that people are doing that over and over in the 18th century. So it becomes a theme. It becomes something that a producer of remedies can do in the 18th century and will do occasionally. These sources are an indirect way to uncover the patient's perspective. So perhaps the title here at the top is a bit misleading because these ads are, of course, written from the perspective of producers, but there are very many early marketing tricks to be found in the ads. I will show an example in a minute. And these marketing tricks reveal quite a bit about what at least producers imagined that patients might like in a remedy. So in that way, you can have an indirect angle to uncover what patients like in remedies. And this is pharmaceutical big data in a nutshell, as I will show in a second. So if I throw all these ads in a graph, you can see that the distribution of advertisements for fever remedies throughout the 18th century. The beginnings are very humble. It really takes off in the late 1720s. This has everything to do with a fever epidemic that was raging in many Dutch cities in those years. And after that, you see that with wild fluctuations, you encounter many ads for fever remedies in many different newspapers during the 18th century. This is an example. I will not trouble you with reading the whole thing, but this is an advertisement, first advertisement actually, for the remedy that I encountered the most, this famous and widely known Swiss herbal tea. I found over 1,200 ads for these throughout the 18th century. And like many of these secret remedies, it's presented as a panacea against pains of the head, the chest, the loin, stomach, colic, and so on. There's a lot of other interesting information in ads like these. We know where it was sold. This remedy was sold in commission in a coffee house in Amsterdam. So the owner of the coffee house was permitted to sell it on behalf of the producer. These aren't geo locations, but you can understand and find out where exactly this was. And we know it was sold as a package. It was sold for 12 stuivers. With so many advertisements, I can even the marketing strategy of the producer. So I know in which cities advertisements were produced to trace over decades what or where we can find advertisements. So this is something to say about the marketing strategy of the producer or whoever was behind this remedy, because I have not been able to find out about that. Quickly moving on to the other end of the medical marketplace, where the crude components for making drugs entered the market, or the Dutch market of the Republic. This concerns public auctions of crude drugs, both simple, so bark, seeds, root, and so on, and some semi-finished products like essential oils or chemical products. For this collection, I have complementary sources. I do not have to rely on the ads alone. There's a lot of archival material for these public auctions. And again, this is pharmaceutical big data in a nutshell. So if you have drugs to sell in 18th century Amsterdam, you go to bourse and you team up with a broker in drugs. They are specialized brokers who can be found at a certain pillar in the bourse, like the one you see in the image on the left. The broker will then take over the process of selling your goods. He knows the market value of your goods. He knows potential buyers. So he can do a lot to help you sell those crude substances. And those public auctions usually take place in the Brakkelgrond, the brackish ground, which is an inn and also an auction house in the center of Amsterdam. Like the example I show here from 1752, two brokers selling 20 saroons, that's an animal skin, to saroons of Peruvian bark, and 11 barrels of turpentine and some other goods. And again, this is data, if you will. All these advertisements follow the same formula, so it's relatively easy to extract relevant entities like names of persons, the time and the day and hour of an auction location, and different products. And if you do that for many different products across the 18th century, you can draw graphs like this. On the top, you see isinglass, Peruvian bark, and sarsaparilla root. In the middle row, there's shellac, rhubarb root, and cinnamon. And in the lower row, there's benzoin, yalapa root, and Sicilian manna. These were all pharmaceutical products. And what you can see here is trends in the availability of these substances. This is all on the level of individual transactions. So merchant X selling a product to buyer Y for a certain price. And as you can see, the numbers differ quite a bit. So sarsaparilla root goes to 120, whereas Peruvian bark goes to 1200. But all these substances have a well, commercial dynamic of their own that's worth investigating. Just by way of an example, I've focused especially on Peruvian bark, which is arguably the biggest product that can be found in these auctions. And I wrote an entire chapter about this little peak here, which has again to do with the fever epidemic of 1727 that also sparked advertising practices in secret remedies. So to zoom out just a little bit, I will give two examples of a global perspective for both the public and the merchant's perspective. So for the public perspective, we can see in ads for secret remedies the beginnings of mail-order pharmacy. This is again an example of an ad for a secret remedy. I will only draw your attention. Can be sent to the East and West Indies without decay. Now this is something that I encountered in quite a number of advertisements, and it's a very interesting claim that needs further study if these remedies were actually sent across the world as their producer. Then on the commercial side, I have been able to trace the locations of many of the brokers in drugs that I encountered in auctions, but one went missing at some point, Hermanus Ristenpad. I lost track of him in 1796, but I discovered that he migrated to New York. I found two places where he lived in Manhattan, and it turns out that he continued his practice as a broker, as can be seen in this advertisement from the Daily Advertiser in 1797, where he again is selling drugs like he did while he was still living in Europe. And I have strong reason to believe that he maintained connections with Europe while he was in New York. So to conclude, newspaper ads offer big data for the history of pharmacy already in the early modern period. They offer long-term perspectives of availability and use, so all kinds of aspects, all parts of the medical marketplace. But at the same time, they offer a lot of input for short-term narratives about the different places, people, and products that were involved in this medical marketplace. I argued that the global market for remedies already starts in the 18th century, although it has a dynamic of its own when you compare it to the 17th and the 19th century. So it really takes off when compared to the 17th century, but of course, in comparison to the 19th century, it is much smaller than what happens in the 19th century, obviously. The numbers are quite significant, and you can already see quite some trends that will evolve really in the 19th century. And finally, I have hoped to show that the Dutch case can be used as a possible starting point for global modern history of pharmacy writing. Much of this can be found in my dissertation, which is available for download. And on that note, I thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful panel. There are some questions already in the chat box. I have some questions for everybody. I think all the speakers can put their cameras on at the same time so that we can have a conversation. But if that crashes, it's totally not my fault. Okay, so questions. The first question from the chat box is from Greg Higby. And it asks, Matt and Erica, have you compared drug advertisements for international brands like Bayer aspirin? Are they different in different locations? Use that kind of variety.
Yeah, cheers for the question, Gregory. Actually, this was the exact recommendation, David, that you made to Eric and I about a year and a half ago when we met in Buffalo. So the short answer is we are trying. And we have certainly thought about it and looked at things. What, from a kind of casual glance, what I would say is that the surface level, there are surface level differences in something like how aspirin gets marketed across the world, but the sort of deeper grammar of the adverts doesn't change very much. So in some way, for me, that kind of underscores the idea that we need to think about this as a global story and as a story about the spread of global capitalism. But I reserve the right to change my mind when we've had a deeper look.
Is that, Erica, are you also going to add words? Or we? Yeah?
Sorry, no, that's good.
Okay. We have a couple of questions. I'd like to combine the next two questions from Greg Bond and Taylor Dysart, because they both are about advertisements that might pit different forms of modernity or tradition against each other. So Greg Bond asks, is the tension between modernity and traditional cultures, points to that example of the beer ad from Senegal, is that tension common? How do the advertisements play off ideas of tradition and modernity? And Taylor asks, what about different versions of modernity, like the kind of modernity represented by the United States as compared to local versions of modernity that might want to define themselves against the United States?
This probably could go to everyone, but I think I've been looking at that question in the chat box, and it's an interesting question. And I think when we think about national belonging as a feature of modernity, we see those features most strongly. So looking at the Canadian ads, for example, we see different ways that Canadian ads will embrace British products for a while, or French products as a way of belonging to a kind of Canadian colonial experience, part of an empire. And there's implicit in that is sometimes a rejection of American ads. We certainly see that more in the popular media, so in the Maclean's ads, for example. But then when we compare this with something like in Colombia, there's also interesting ebbs and flows in terms of the ways in which national products are reified. Like, you can drink any kind of coffee, but Colombian coffee from these fields, and they will show sort of images, even stenciled images of like working in the fields to suggest that this is truly a Colombian heritage and part of a Colombian proud agricultural tradition. So we see this sense of belonging woven into it in ways that play upon tradition as well as empire. And I think the anti-American pieces in there, if that's what you're kind of asking, or a distinction from American pieces, is sometimes more subtle. And I suspect that as we go forward in time, we haven't collected, at least on the Canadian side, we haven't collected the ones in the 1990s yet. But I think that becomes more and more explicit over time. So.
Excellent. There is a new question from Robin Kipps, and it asks about material culture. Have you had a chance to look at museum collections? And this is for everybody, I think. For containers of the advertised medicines, do you see anything additional to be gleaned by looking at the materiality as well as the marketing? And if any of you would like to speak to that.
Anyone? We haven't looked at the material culture aspect yet. And partly this is a result of trying to do work with the materials that we have available to us without being able to travel right now or visit places. But luckily, we've scanned a lot of the ads ahead of time. So this summer we spent sort of processing, digesting that, putting it into a database. But it's something that I think would be a wonderful addition to this project as we move forward.
I've been looking at some museum material to find 18th century containers of remedies, but there are not so many there. But I keep on looking, if only to, well, to discover if this claim of a global connection, well, it was just a claim that you can find in newspapers, or if it really happened.
And I personally didn't look for any kind of material culture. It was sort of out of the scope of the methods I was trying to use for my paper, which I wanted to keep very much within what does newspaper advertising look like.
Thank you. Now it is 12:02. I do have one question I'd like to ask, but first I'm going to give a quick message from Clark Ridgway of the AIHP. I know people may need to leave before this last question gets asked and answered. Clark says, on behalf of the AIHP, we express our sincere thanks to all those who presented in and hosted the incredibly varied and high quality panels and presentations of the festival, and extend a special thanks to Kristen, Greg, and Luke for all their efforts in organizing and successfully delivering a great experience for the entirety of the festival. Heartily agree with that. Well, clap on behalf of everybody. And then one question I had for everybody was that a lot of these analysis are of the products of advertising, kind of the end point where you have a finished product. And I'm curious about how you perceived of the actors and the machinery that produced those products. What were advertisers are they actors in this? Are they just kind of bearers of messages from authorities to the public, or do they play some role in shaping the messages? Does their role differ in different contexts depending on, are they and does it, in terms of being from one geographic location to another or over time, how do you see the role of the people who produce these images and advertisements? Any of you for this one?
David, thank you for the question. I don't have a great answer, but I'll just add to the complexity of it. So one of the challenges that Eric and I have had is, in some cases, the producers of these products have in-house advertising teams. In some cases, they're using global advertising firms, usually based in places like New York and London. And in some cases, global products are being advertised by the actual merchants selling them themselves on the ground. So someone who sets up a stall in India, in the early 20th century, might put their own spin on things. And I think what's really challenging is because we're working from the ads themselves, it's hard to know which is which. So we can't look at it and say, oh, this was definitely produced by the in-house team at Aspirin, or at Bayer rather. But I think the question is a really important one, and I just haven't found a way to work around it yet.
Same goes for me. Actually, I have very little information about who is behind the advertisements. So sometimes I get small clues as to who they are. Could be university-trained physicians, but they could also be absolute nobodies with no medical credentials whatsoever, and everything in between. But it's very difficult to to find out there's a lot of forgery going on. So sometimes somebody just steals a name and well, selling sort of the same remedy under his own name, and then somebody starts complaining about it in another issue of the same newspaper. So that's very difficult to find out.
For my research, encountered the exact same conditions and difficulties described by the other panelists. And I guess one extra nuance that I would like to add to that was that in the paid newspapers from the early 20th century that I was looking at, the newspapers themselves also were often advertising slots and would carry columns explaining to potential advertisers what audiences seem to react well to, what their specific audiences might react well to, and they would have weekly tips on what to emphasize, what not to emphasize. So all I mean to say is that these advertisements were shaped by a lot of different actors, including the newspapers themselves.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I have so many other questions, but of course, it is time for us to go. Thanks again to you all. Thanks again to the conference organizers. And I'm looking forward to interacting with many of you over the next weeks and months as we move towards special issues of the journals to continue the conversation. Luke, is there anything else that I need to impart before we say our farewells?
All I want to do is say thanks to everyone here and say, thanks to the panel now. On behalf of Kristen and Greg, it's been a pleasure working with all of you. It's been very professional and enjoyable at the same time, which is the most out of working in a small subfield like this. I just want to encourage you to turn on your cameras now and say goodbye to each other face to face. And then maybe we can crash the system and get a couple of final screenshots. And maybe we'll try and do something like this again in a year's time after we recover here in Madison.